Hello and welcome to Module 4 on markets and competition. I'm really excited about doing this module because I can talk about Aliko Dangote and I can dispel all the myths about some of the things that are said about him, that people say about him. So I really like this module because it digs deep into market power and how much influence a particular company has on its market. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. So not much to do here. We'll talk about pricing and output behavior when there's perfect competition, monopolistic competition, and monopoly. And all the assumptions and assumptions that need to be made about these structures we'll talk about. We'll also talk about measures of monopoly power, and finally we'll talk about monopsonies. So most people know Monopoly as a game, but it's not just a game, it's also a market structure. So let's get into it. So before I start talking about our Uncle Aliko Dangote, I'm going to go through the concept of economic cost versus accounting cost and accounting profit versus economic profit, because I feel like accountants and economists always sort of have very different definitions of these concepts. And whenever I'm speaking about a topic, I like to start with the basic definitions before I start using them during the course. So the concepts are similar. Economic cost versus accounting cost is just the way that economists view cost as opposed to accountants. So an accountant would view, let's say, all these lawyers that graduate in Nigeria. They graduate every year, and an accountant would see this lawyer, let's call him Sule, who starts a small chops business. And in the course of that small chops business, he has to spend 5,000 naira on flour and whatever he needs to make the small chops. So an accountant would look at his balance sheet or his financials and say, okay, Sule spent $5,000, 5,000 naira, and that is his accounting cost. However, an economist would say, that Sule could have gotten a job in Aluko and Oyobode, or even in one of those UK firms like Allen and Overy, and he could be earning $100,000, and instead he only made 5,000. So the cost is not just the cost that was expended, but it's also the opportunity cost. And the same with the concept of economic profit and accounting profit. See, accountants just take into consideration, accounting, period. And it only involves the explicit costs when you are calculating profits. But the economists don't just look at the explicit costs, like the cost of flour. They also look at the opportunity costs. So they won't say you made a profit just because you made 200 naira. Sule is a lawyer and he could be working in a much better place. So how profitable was he compared to what he sacrificed to do that? So I think I've explained that pretty clearly enough. There are good resources on this because this is something that gets confused quite a lot. So if you need extra resources of Google, of Wikipedia, please go ahead. But now I'm going to get into the meat of the unit. Perfect competition. This is Serena and Naomi Osaka, and I think that what they play is just perfect. The skill, the beauty of the game, and I think that they're good players. It's a really good watch in tennis. And perfect competition is a market situation where it's a hypothetical, so it doesn't really, I think it's very difficult to find a perfectly competitive market in real life, but it's a hypothetical market where competition is at its greatest possible level. And neoclassical economists always argued that perfect competition would produce the best outcomes for consumers and society. So perfectly competitive markets exhibit the following characteristics. Number one, there is perfect knowledge with no information failure or no lags in the flow of information. So knowledge about everything about the product is available to all participants in the market, which means risk taking is minimal because you know what you're getting into, and the role of the entrepreneur is kind of limited. All producers and consumers have perfect knowledge, so they make rational decisions to maximize their self-interest, and consumers look to maximize their utility. There are no barriers to entry or exit, and all the products are homogeneous, identical units that are not branded with anything. Everything kind of looks the same. Each unit of output also in terms of labor is also homogeneous. In a perfectly competitive market, no single firm can influence the market price or the market conditions. So the single firm in a perfectly competitive market is said to be a price taker. It's taking its price from the whole industry. The single firm will not increase its price independently, because if you increase your price, you won't be able to sell any goods. And the rational producer will not lower the market price below the market price given that it can sell all the products that it produces. In perfectly competitive markets, there are always a lot of firms in the market because there's no barrier to entry. And there are no externalities, so there are no third parties involved in the transaction. And firms can only make normal profits in the long run, even though they can make abnormal super profits in the short run. So I can't really think of any typical Nigerian examples of perfect competition. I guess the most sort of closest example that I can think of is, people that sell gala by the side of the road. Because, the product is identical, everybody knows what it is, and, nobody's going to overpay for it, and there's so many people selling it. But even that isn't perfect competition, because you have gala, you have like the other type of other one that has a bit more meat inside it. And really, right now, as I speak, I don't really know the price of gala, but maybe like fan milk as well. Some of those like yogurts that they sell by the side of the road where there's tons and tons of sellers. It's really easy to get into the business, really easy to get out of the business. But, it's actually very, very difficult to think about the ideal perfect competition. I think that's the closest that you get, but even that isn't perfect competition. So it's a hypothetical situation, and I'll just show you the graph on the next slide. So this is a graph, and the industry price is determined by the interaction of supply and demand, leading to a price, which is called PE. And the individual firm will maximize output where marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs. So at this stage here, which is where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, that's Q1. In the long run, profits will make firms will make normal profits. If supernormal profits are made, people will see that these people are making money, and new firms will be attracted into the industry, and the prices will fall, because remember, there's free entry and exit. There's nothing stopping them from coming into the industry. And if the firms are making a loss, then they will leave the industry, causing the price to rise. So that's perfect competition. If there's an increase in demand, then there will be an increase in price. Therefore, the demand curve and AR will fall. And this will allow firms to make supernormal profits. But once people see that there's money in this business, it attracts them and they go back to the equilibrium. An increase in firms' cost will mean that the AC curve, that's the average cost curve, will increase. Therefore, AR is less than AC. So the average revenue now becomes less than the cost. When that happens, of course, firms will start making a loss. Firms will go out of business, and this pushes the prices back up. So they kind of stay in this equilibrium in perfect competition. Now, monopolies. And I love this picture because when you talk about monopolies in Nigeria, everybody thinks of my mentor Aliko Dangote and the communist example, mentor from afar anyway, and the communist example of monopoly in America. People think of Microsoft and Bill Gates, and this is a great picture of them together. And in this section, I'll be telling you actually why Dangote is not a monopoly. So a pure monopoly is defined as a single seller of a product with 100% of the market share. A monopoly maximizes profits where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost at point M. It sets a price of PM here and a quantity of QM here. Now, in a monopsony is a market condition where there's only one buyer. So it's like a parallel to the monopoly. The monopoly, there's only one seller. In a monopsony, there's only one buyer, the monopsonist. And like a monopsony has imperfect information, it has an imperfect market condition. The difference between a monopoly and a monopsony is primarily about the difference between the controlling entities. Here, a single buyer dominates the monopsonized market, whereas in a monopoly, a single seller controls a monopolized market. Monopsonists are common in areas where they supply most or all of the region's jobs. So I gave an example on the last slide of the NHS. So people use that as an example where the NHS in the UK actually controls sort of most of the employment of healthcare workers. So a monopsony can also be common in labor markets where a single employer has an advantage over the workforce. When this happens, potential employees may agree to a lower wage because of factors resulting from the company's buying control. So it drives down the wages and increases the profit margins. And a point about monopsonies is because of the buyer's power, it can lead to exploitation of employed workers. Back to monopoly now, and this is another person that people call a monopolist, Jeff Bezos. This is like my favorite jacket. This is my favorite outfit that I've ever seen Jeff Bezos wear because it just shows that he's beyond fashion. He's bigger than fashion. It doesn't matter. People still respect him no matter what he wears. So that's why it's my favorite picture. So going back to monopolies, I think it's important to also be able to measure the degree of a monopoly. And there's a few ways of doing that. People use concentration ratios. People use the Lerner index. And people use what's called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index as well. So I'll briefly talk about all three of them. The concentration ratio in economics is the ratio that indicates the size of firms in their industry relative to the industry as a whole. So it would talk about sort of the size of an individual firm, say Dangote, relative to the whole cement industry. And this is why, I'm really surprised that people say that Dangote is a monopolist. Because even though he does have a relatively large size compared to the rest of the industry, that size has been shrinking. So it was Dangote Company and Lafarge initially controlling, and Lafarge was a lot bigger than Dangote previously. Dangote grew, but other players came into the market. So there's a company called Purechem, an Indian company that also is in the cement business and is growing its market share. And then Bua came into the market in a massive way and has also been eroding into that market share and growing that market share. So the concentration ratio in economics is the ratio that indicates the size of firms in relation to the industry as a whole. And you can see that over the years, Dangote has actually lost, or the concentration ratio has reduced relative to the industry size as a whole, not increased. Of recent, of course. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index is an alternative indicator of firm size, and it's calculated by squaring the percentage share of each firm in an industry and then summing up these squared market shares to derive the HHI, as it's called. And the HHI has a fair amount of correlation to the concentration ratio and also can be a better measure of market concentration. The Lerner index is a measure of monopoly power which equals the markup over marginal cost as a percentage of price. So that looks at how much, because we've said that monopolies are price makers. So while perfect competition, they're price takers, the market gives them the price. Monopolies are price makers, they dictate the price. And how much are these so-called, the people that we're trying to call monopolies, how much is their markup over the marginal cost as a percentage of the price? And it ranges from 0 in a perfect competition to 1 in the case of a pure monopoly. So obviously in the case of perfect competition, they can't charge anything. They can't, even in the long, like we said, in the long term, in the long run, they can't make supernormal profits. But in pure monopolies, they can make supernormal profits. So the closer it is to 1 and the more markup they're able to make over the marginal cost as a percentage of price, the more it's likely that the Lerner ratio considers it to be a monopoly. The final market type that we're going to consider is monopolistic competition. And a monopolistic competition is different from monopoly. A monopoly exists when a person or an entity is the exclusive supplier of a good or service in the market. And like I explained, Dangote is not the exclusive supplier of cement in Nigeria. We have Lafarge, we have Unisem, we have other small cement suppliers as well, and obviously we have Bua. So that doesn't really meet the definition of a monopoly. But yeah, enough of me ranting about Dangote. But monopolistic competition is different from monopoly because it's because it shares some of the features of perfect competition and some of the features of a monopoly. So first of all, its optimum output. At its optimum output, the firm charges a price that exceeds the marginal cost. And the firms also operate with excess capacity. So monopolistic monopolistic competitive markets may have highly differentiated products, and there are always a lot of firms in the market. Firms can also freely enter and exit the market, and that makes it seem like perfect competition, right? But firms can also take decisions independently and have some degree of market power. And then also, maybe due to branding, maybe due to a slight difference in the product, buyers and sellers also have imperfect information, and they're willing to pay something extra in a monopolistically competitive market. So the demand curve for monopolistic competition is downward sloping. Price, there is a relationship between price and quantity produced. That's a relationship. Whereas in perfectly competitive markets, quantity bought. So there's a relationship between price and quantity bought. Here, the price has to stay constant, regardless of the quantity. Whereas in monopoly situations, at high prices, the quantity is lower, but as you can see, that slope is actually quite sharp. So in a perfectly competitive market, the firm's individual demand is perfectly elastic. Firms don't have any market power to be able to raise the price. Whereas in the monopolistic competitive market, they have some power to be able to change their prices. And in the monopoly, the pure monopoly, you can see that there's a lot of power over price, and they can change their price without losing all of their customers. So under monopolistic competition, the price is higher than under perfect competition in the long run. In summary, we've spoken about perfect competition, we've spoken about monopolistic competition, and we've spoken about monopolies. And I'm just going to go through it again. So in a perfect competition, like we said, there are many buyers and many sellers, like the people that sell gala in traffic. In a monopolistic competition, there are also many buyers and many sellers. In a monopoly, there's only one seller. In terms of the nature of the products are all the same in perfect competition. However, in monopolistic competition, the products are slightly different, have an edge. In monopoly, the product is unique. In terms of freedom of entry and exit, in a perfectly competitive market, it's easy to enter and exit. In monopolistic competition, it's easy to enter and exit. In monopoly, there are high barriers to getting into that business, and that's really what makes those monopolists be able to hold the business. In terms of market information, in perfect competition, everybody has information. The buyers and the sellers both have perfect information. There's nothing hidden. In monopolistic competition, they don't have all the information. And in monopolies, they don't have all the information either. In perfect competition, there's no non-price competition. In monopolistic competition, there is non-price competition. So there are differentiators. And in monopoly, there is as well. In terms of market power, in perfect competition, there's zero market power. They are price takers. In monopolistic competition, there's a little bit of market power, but if you push on price too much, you still lose your customers. But compared to perfect competition, if you raise the price slightly, you lose all your customers because everybody has perfect information. Everybody knows what's going on. In Monopoly, you have a lot of market power. Some of the examples here, I'm not too sure about, so I'm not going to go through the examples. Like I said, it's very difficult to have an example of perfect competition. But in monopolistic competition, I'm sure you've seen like restaurants that kind of sell the same food, but they can sell their interior or they have better marketing strategies. And then in monopolies, some of the big water firms, for instance, like, one that supplies for a state or one that supplies for a city, they're monopolies. They have no other competition. So that's the end of this unit. I hope you enjoyed it. And there's plenty of information around on the different graphs. I'd encourage you to have a look at the different graphs for perfect competition, monopolistic competition, and monopoly again, just to get your head around it. But thank you very much for listening, and that's the end of the unit.